By chance was reading my emails, and there was an advert there that said, lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks without hunger. And I said, well, of course that's bogus. I'm a medical doctor. I know that is bogus. But then I noticed there were 3 scientists who had written it, and I knew them, and they were really good scientists. So I said, well, why would they say that? And I also knew that I had 8 weeks to go before I had to go and talk in Sweden to a bunch of elite athletes. And I said, well, I'd look a little better if I was 6 kilograms lighter. So I said, maybe I'm motivated. So I went down and I bought the book. It was called The New Atkins for the New You. And I looked at it, and within an hour, I'd read here that 150 studies show the benefits of a low carbohydrate diet. Well, it's bogus. I mean, I'm a medical doctor. We know low carbohydrate diets are unhealthy. You've got to eat lots of carbohydrate. How can you restrict carbohydrates? I'm a runner. I've written there you must carbo low. So then I looked at the data and I said, my gosh, these papers are published in good scientific journals. So I said, maybe there's something to it. So I said, that's it, no more carbohydrate. So from that minute, I stopped eating carbohydrate. In the next 8 weeks before I got to Sweden, I dropped 11 kilograms and I looked fantastic. And my running started to recover. And then after 3 months, on 1 week, my running just took off. It was astonishing. I couldn't believe it. I started running as I had 20 years before. My times came dramatically down. And so I said, well, there's something miraculous happening here. And I said, eventually I'll share it. And it took me 5 months to get the courage to write an article on it. And I wrote the article called Against the Grains. And I began with, I said, this is the most contentious article I'll ever write. I know I'm going to be castigated for it, but I must just tell you what happened. So I did. And that was the beginning of the whole journey that I've been on. I didn't start trying to convert my profession in any way. I just reported what had happened to me and thought people would be really interested and might even try the diet and see if it worked for them. But of course it's escalated since then. For 33 years, I ate the Prudent Healthy Diet. The Prudent Diet is the diet that was first proposed in 1977 by the US Senate, the McGovern Commission. It was drawn up by a vegan who had no training in nutritional sciences. He was the man who decided what we should eat. And his bias was that we must cut out all saturated fat and we must eat more cereals and grains. And that we must eat between 8 and 11 servings of grains and cereals every day. And that we must limit the amount of fat we eat and we must limit the amount of meat and eggs that we eat. So eggs, which are the most nutritious food there is, have been relegated to a non-food, whereas refined carbohydrates, which are the real non-foods, have been elevated to the status of superfoods. We've done the exact reverse to what biology tells us is good for us. And now we've had 40 or 50 years of the change, and we've seen what the results are. Diabetes and obesity have gone through the roof. And heart failure is also at all-time record rates. And no one questions, hold on, maybe we didn't get it right. Maybe we should falsify that theory and relook at it. I've been on both sides of the argument. I've been eating the Prudent Diet for 33 years, and I saw in a person like myself who's pre-diabetic and carbohydrate intolerant or resistant, it's toxic. How you can tell if you're carbohydrate intolerant is you progressively gain weight with age when you eat a high carbohydrate diet. Now, if we then look at what we think carbohydrate intolerance is it's people who, when you give them carbohydrate, they can't put it into their muscles. So they have to oversecrete insulin. And when they oversecrete insulin in this condition, the carbohydrate gets into the liver where it's turned into fat. Now, at the same time, they go into what we call the hibernation response, which is they start storing fat around their bodies, and they become less physically active, and they eat more. So the problem of the metabolic syndrome is not caused by overeating. The metabolic syndrome is a form of hibernation which causes excessive overeating and reduced physical activity. The typical way that the metabolic syndrome is managed in medicine is that we look at each of your risk factors and we treat it separately. So if you've got high blood pressure, we treat the high blood pressure with medication. If your cholesterol's up, we treat the cholesterol with medication. If you're hypoglycemic, i.e. pre-diabetic, we treat the diabetes. And so we just compound and medicate whatever it is. So then you get reflux, and then that's treated with another medication. So you get people with eating handfuls of drugs. And no one questions what's the underlying cause. I cut cereals early, and the first thing I noticed was that the allergic rhinitis and the allergic bronchitis, which I would get attacks every 3 months and which I had to treat with inhaled steroids, so they weren't minor conditions, disappeared. I haven't had an attack in 2 years. I haven't had a day's illness in 2 years. The next thing I noticed, my headaches. I used to get headaches once every week or so, and I'd take quite powerful medication. They disappeared. I haven't had a headache in 2 years, and I can't explain it. The third thing is I stopped using my glasses. I can't explain that either. My fourth thing was that I had reflux, with gastric reflux, which is this dyspepsia or indigestion. And it was so bad for 10 years that I thought I'm going to have an operation. That disappeared in a month. And I had irritable bowel syndrome. I've had irritable bowel syndrome since I was a child. And it disappeared. And then the energy. And I just love exercising again. I can't wait to get out and run. So the funniest thing is I'm enjoying all these benefits. And people are saying, you're going to kill yourself from heart disease because of your cholesterol and all this sort of stuff. And my argument is, well, why don't you try it? The most interesting effect of this diet, which I could never have predicted, was my hunger has completely disappeared. And I no longer have hunger. I will see food that I like to eat, and then I will get a mild stirring, say, okay, let's eat a lot of this food. But the old cravings, I don't get them anymore. And then I realized that most of what people call appetite is a food addiction or a food craving. So the person who gets up in the morning and eats lots of refined carbohydrates and sugar, within 3 hours they've got a craving to re-eat that same food, because the brain has been overstimulated by the insulin and the glucose and all sorts of other neuropeptides that are influencing the brain's decision to eat. And they drive you to eat 3 hours later, and so you're hungry. But I don't get that anymore. And I could go easily 24 hours without eating without even noticing it. And I can go and run and do anything I like. So, and I interpret this as my appetite is now being driven by biology. I reduced my calorie consumption by 1/3, from 3,000 to 2,000 calories, and I'm not hungry. But if I tried to reduce from 3,000 to 2,000 on a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, I would be perpetually hungry. I would be looking for food all the time, and I would not be able to sustain it. I can sustain this eating pattern for the rest of my life. A lot of people ask, is this diet that I'm eating ideal for everyone? And the answer is, I would never make that claim. But I would make the claim that if you treat me and anyone else who's got the metabolic syndrome or who has carbohydrate resistance, by feeding them carbohydrates, you're just making them sick. Bruce Fordyce has reversed his running career. Sean Mickeljohn, who won the Comrades in the 1990s, has done the same. Oscar Chalupsky has done the same. And the four of us, the four fatties, we lost over 50 kilograms of weight. Now, these are people who exercised much more religiously than I did. Bruce Fordyce has run 200 marathons or ultramarathons. No one in South Africa has done more exercise than him. Yet he puts on 12 kilograms because he's carbohydrate intolerant and he's eating a high carbohydrate diet. Sean Mickeljohn puts on 16 kilograms and his running gets destroyed. And Oscar Chalupsky the same. Oscar drops 16 kilograms and wins a world championship at the age of 49 against young children of the early 20s. These are guys who won Olympic gold medals. And he beats them in a 3-hour, 50-kilometer race in Hawaii. People say, oh, it's just, because you were lazy and you were this and that and the other that you got fat. Not at all. We were vigorously active. We weren't slothful, we weren't gluttonous, but we didn't understand what our problem was. And as soon as we understood, we reversed the aging process dramatically. I was actually surprised by the response to my ideas, because initially all I said was, I've just cut cereals. And then the dietitians got angry because they said, well, you've got to eat cereals for health. Well, I looked at the literature and it's not true. There's a whole bunch of medical conditions which are directly related to cereal consumption. And I think that the minor symptoms I had were due to cereal intolerance. So I listen to the nutritionists when they debate with me. They say, well, everyone must eat the same diet and there must be lots of carbohydrates because carbohydrates are good for you and vegetables and fruits are good and cereals and grains will make you live forever. Which may be true if you're carbohydrate tolerant, but if you're carbohydrate resistant, that is completely wrong. What nutritionists have to understand is that not everyone can eat this prudent diet. I mean, the studies show that you give that diet to people like me, and all that happens is we become diabetic. I think there are many reasons why people would be angry with me, because they think that there's no science behind it, but honestly, I would not have taken the stance unless I'd read the literature, and I outread everyone. And I probably collected 70 or more books on this topic, and I've read all of them, and I've read probably 2,000 or 3,000 articles, scientific articles on the topic. And so what I'm saying is as a synthesis of that information. And of course, I'm writing the book at the moment, and that book will be released next year. And then it's exactly the same as Waterlogged. I wrote this book because people said what you say is rubbish. And they said it for 30 years. And industry attacked me and demonized me as being some sort of conspiracy theorist. And I said, well, wait till you read the book. They are chup still, because this is the truth. And this is the heavy science. Now, no one can argue at all. And I'm going to do the same with that book on nutrition and health. The one theory, of course, is that if you eat too much fat, I'm going to kill myself from heart disease because my blood cholesterol is going to go up and the cholesterol is clogging my arteries. So if you eat artery clogging saturated fat, you're going to get heart disease. It is my contention that this is an inflammatory disease due to high carbohydrate intakes and this glucose insulin spiking, which irritates the arteries. And then cholesterol is certainly laid down, but it's not the criminal. It just happens to be at the site of the murder. And people have claimed it's the murderer, but it's not the murderer. And there's very good evidence that it's much more likely to be glucose and insulin that are driving the arterial disease than it's the cholesterol. I don't contend that you have to have cholesterol to cause the problem, but to make a whole hypothesis on the basis that we must reduce cholesterol and stop people eating fat has had catastrophic consequences for our health. Statins is a sort of colloquial name for drugs that lower cholesterol, and they really started in the 1980s where the first of them came about. And they discovered these drugs that could reduce cholesterol. So then they said, well, of course, cholesterol causes heart disease. So if we lower the cholesterol, we're going to prevent heart disease. And they then started on major studies. I mean, the number of studies that there have been there are large numbers, and these studies all cost billions of dollars. And my skepticism relates to two things. The first is that I'm not certain that lowering cholesterol explains exactly why the drugs work. Secondly, I don't argue that they certainly work in people with established heart disease. But in healthy people, I want to see what's the magnitude of the effect. In one study, the benefit was one patient in 100 got benefit from this medication. So 99 people took the drug and got no benefit whatsoever. But yet they're at high risk because these drugs are very potent. And cholesterol is a very, very important chemical in your body. And once you start tinkering with it, you don't know what the long-term consequences are. And so the claims are made by the cardiologists that these drugs are now generic and they're cheap. They're not cheap. The sales of these drugs are $29 billion a year. That is not a cheap drug. They have no side effects, which is bogus. Most people stop taking them within a year because of side effects. And then finally, they never put them up against anything else. I'm convinced that there would be good evidence if you put people on high-fat diets and got them to exercise, you would have a much bigger effect than the statins have ever achieved. But it's too difficult. You see, it's much easier just to give a statin, and then the patient believes, oh, you see, my risk is heart attacks reduced 30%, so that means I'm never going to have a heart attack. That's utterly bogus. You're still at high risk. You've reduced it slightly, but you're still at high risk. And you better get out there and check your glucose tolerance and see if you've got the metabolic syndrome and see if you're hypoglycemic and so on. And become physically active, because otherwise it's not going to make much difference, that statin. I every day receive a letter from someone saying, thank you for saving my life. And the most recent letter I received was from a doctor in Caledon, a general practitioner. And he says, Professor Noakes, 4 months ago, I weighed 120 kilograms. I heard you speak on television, and I immediately decided I was carbohydrate intolerant and with the metabolic syndrome. At the time, I was medicated for 5 conditions. The 5 we mentioned, he also had atrial fibrillation. His heart was beating irregularly, and he was taking that medication, and he had gout. He said 4 months later, I've dropped all my medication, weight has gone down 20 kilograms, and I've dropped every single medication. My blood pressure is normal, my cholesterol is normal, my diabetes is normal, my gout's gone, my atrial fibrillation is gone. I do not need any medication. I now understand what you're talking about. He says it's completely changed my approach to medicine. And what I'm doing with the people in Caledon is to find how can I get the poor people eat more protein and fat. It's the poor people who take the burden of ill health because they have massive rates of diabetes, and the women have breast cancers and other cancers, all of which are nutritionally based. So what would I like to achieve? Very simply, I now believe from what I've read, the 70 books that I've read, is that nutrition is a critical determinant of our health. And I would estimate that something like 80% of the chronic illnesses that we currently experience are due to nutritional problems. Now, I was not taught that, and it's not being taught in any medical campus that I know about. In my view, I've probably affected tens of thousands of South Africans simply by making this stance. And I would have thought that people in my profession would say, thank you, Tim, for A, elevating the profile of our profession and for doing something for so many people. I'm happy that I can control my weight and I can control my hunger. And I'm very proud about that. And that's what I'm trying to tell the people. Because everyone's lost control. They don't know how to control their weights. And it's so simple. And this is the simple explanation. So that's my message. Take control.